Addict or asshole? There's this debate in the sex addiction field. A lot of it's driven by the betrayed partners, right? Is my husband a sex addict or is he an asshole? And I'm going to kind of clear up those two definitions for those who haven't really heard this argument, right? So, there's an addict, right? Somebody who has become chemically addicted to, in the case of sex and pornography, chemically addicted to dopamine, right? So they are addicted to the dopamine that comes from sexually acting out. And then there's the asshole, right? And the philosophy of the is that he is entitled to getting his sexual needs met however he wants to get them met, right? That he's just going to go and do these things. He's going to hide them from his partner. He's going to lie to his partner, and he feels, the right to do this, right? So that would be what people would call an. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce kind of a third option here. Now, I want to clear this up by saying I'm not anti-sex addict. There are definitely men who are chemically addicted to the dopamine from sex and pornography. And then I'm also not anti-asshole. There are out there who just act like okay, so I'm not saying that you're not going to find one of the two of those, but I want to introduce a third option. But let's kind of walk through all three here. First, let's talk about a sex addict, right? How do you know you're an addict? How do you know your husband's an addict? So a sex addict would be again, by definition, somebody who's become chemically dependent, addicted to dopamine from sexually acting out. So this would be, dopamine is responsible. It's not pleasure. A lot of people don't know that. It does not provide us pleasure. Dopamine is for focus and motivation. So when somebody uses something dopaminergic, their focus and motivation goes on it, right? So if there is a important work project that you're trying to complete, dopamine will be released for you to be motivated and focused to complete the project. So dopamine itself isn't bad. And if you actually don't have it, you have Parkinson's. That's what Parkinson's is. So we need dopamine to live. However, dopamine, because it's responsible for focus and motivation, what the brain can sometimes figure out is it will engage in this certain practice or behavior, and it'll get dopamine and it will capture their focus and motivation. So what's that do? It pulls it off of other things. It takes your attention away from everything else. And the more dopaminergic the thing is, the more your brain's going to become captivated by it. And again, why do people get addicted to these things that release dopamine? Well, if they don't like the things around them, they don't like the feelings, the thoughts, they don't like the deadlines, they don't like the stress, whatever it is, if they don't like the negativity, the negative emotions or thoughts or feelings, they'll do something dopaminergic. And during that time that they're doing it, the negative thoughts and feelings are gone, right? Because if this thing's really dopaminergic, such as sex and pornography, because sex is so captivating, it activates us because it is a biological need and a biological desire for reproduction. It captivates, parts of our body that, very few things do, right? So it's very dopaminergic to engage in sexual acting out. So it hijacks all your brain's focus and motivation and pulls it all the way to the sexual acting out. So it's very, very, very effective. That would be a sex addict, a porn addict. So this would be somebody who's truly addicted to it, right? So when they are in need of dopamine, in need for an escape, right? Because that's kind of the hallmark of a dopaminergic practice. It's escaping your life. It's escaping these emotions. It's escaping the stressors. It's this escape, this release, right? I don't like my life. I don't like my job. I don't like who I am. I don't like the way I look, right? All this negativity. It's a way to kind of get away from that. Now, on this topic though, I don't think all men are sex addicts and porn addicts. In fact, I actually think it's less men than more men. I really do. Again, we don't have studies yet to prove what's driving these men, their unwanted sexual behavior. But again, there are men who do hate their life themselves, the way they look, their marriage, their job, whatever, and then they want to escape their life. But there's also men who really love their job. They love their careers. They love who they are. They love themselves. They don't have a lot of this emotional unregulation. And so they're not necessarily using sex and pornography to emotionally regulate. Now, another way that I would say, to kind of challenge the whole addict thing is of a guy who's had one affair and 2 one-night stands over the past 2 years. Is he an addict? It's kind of like saying the person who has drinks to drunkenness at weddings and goes out with their friends and drinks to kind of dance, have a good time. Is that person an alcoholic? Because 1 time a month or 2 times a month they're drinking to drunkenness and having fun with their friends. Is that person an alcoholic? The definitions that I have seen from alcoholism, that actually doesn't meet that definition necessarily, right? So like that, are we making men sex addicts, porn addicts who are not addicts? And again, it's not semantics. It's, a lot of people are like, oh, why does it matter what we call it? Well, it does though, because it affects the treatment. The bulk of the treatment in the sex and porn addiction space, because we've chosen to call it sex and porn addiction, the bulk of the treatment strategies are addiction treatment strategies. And so for the man who's truly addicted to pornography and sex, if he's really addicted, he can't stop, he's addicted to it, then yes, those treatments would work. And we actually do see that. For me personally, about, 20% of my compulsive behaviors, unwanted behaviors, came from addiction to sex and pornography. So when I got into treatment, 20% of my acting out behaviors did actually go away. They did reduce with those treatments. But again, 80% of them stayed there. And it was frustrating me, it was frustrating my wife, but that's because it's not just an addiction. Some guys might not have an addiction at all. So then are the treatments going to be effective whatsoever? So let's kind of pop over to the hole. Now, hole, right? This is a man who's getting his sexual needs met outside of the marriage. He's not necessarily addicted. He can kind of stop. If you told him to stop and forced him to stop, he could stop. So again, he's not an addict. And this is a lot of the guys in my groups. I would say 2 guys in each group actually have some addictive, dopaminergic, addictive trends to their behavior. But a lot of the guys in my groups, once they got caught, they got sober. They got sober quick, and then acting out again really wasn't that hard for them to stop acting out. It wasn't like this challenge. And again, it's because they weren't addicted, right? So then again, that begs the question. So then, Roland, they're just well, I don't know about that. Now, kind of hear me out here. An asshole to me would be somebody who truly just doesn't care about anybody but themselves. They're just going to kind of do whatever. They just want pleasure now, and they don't really care about what the consequences are. They're just going to kind of do the thing, and they're kind of this way in a lot of areas of their life. They just don't really care. Is the person a narcissist? I don't know if we necessarily need to call them that, but they just don't have a lot of consideration for other people and the ramification of their actions. So, okay, you could call that person, I suppose. But let's look at this from a little bit of a bigger perspective here. A lot of the guys in my groups then would fall into that category of myself included. And I don't know if that's a great word to call them. I mean, these men, when they come into my groups, they are in tears, at least somebody's in tears every week over what they have done to their wives. I mean, these men regret their actions. A lot of them are ashamed. A lot of them never told anyone, not even their best friends, about what they were doing. They hid this from everyone. There was so much shame. They knew that this would destroy their reputation. This would destroy their marriage, destroy their relationships. If their kids found out, their kids would lose all respect for them. They may never speak to them again, right? So these men were aware of that, and then they did it anyways, right? And this kind of rings true with compulsivity, right? If you look at, compulsivity, somebody who's compulsive isn't chemically addicted per se, but they do things that are against their morals and values, and they know they are, but they can't help it. They end up doing it. But again, they're not addicted in the sense that they aren't chemically dependent on it. Now again, why does that matter? Because the treatments are different. The treatments are different for somebody who's addicted versus somebody who's not. Okay, it was a bit of a different treatment approach there. So to expand on this, if we look at these men who are assholes, the problem is, why are they doing this behavior, and why can't they stop themselves even though they know they don't want to do it? It's usually not until they get caught when they finally say, okay, crap, I can't do this anymore. Well, because they see value in the behavior. So in the case of an affair or flirting, they're getting this exchange from this individual. For a lot of the guys in my groups and myself, it's a lot of attention, validation, right? They want to feel special. They want to feel chosen. They want to feel lusted after. They want, men to envy them. They want women to want to be with them, right? So it's a process that they really have become compulsive around, where they're chasing these narratives, these brain stories. And so they're trying to get that met however they can. The truth is, a lot of their compulsivity actually shows up not sexually. It also shows up at work with trying to win awards, win big contracts, become number one in their company, right? So again, they're chasing these stories of feeling wanted, lusted after, chosen, special, whatever their particular process is that they're chasing. So again, are they an asshole because they're chasing those things? Again, I think that's kind of up to you to decide. I don't think that chasing those things makes them an asshole, and here's why. I think high achieving men, one of their greatest gifts is that they are a shapeshifter. They are chameleons. They can read people, and then they can become whoever they need to become to please that person, to win their trust, to win their friendship, whatever it is. They're very, very good at that. And that is why these men are typically really good in business, is they can shapeshift and become whatever they need to become to get the desired result, right? And that's great for business. The challenge is Every time we do that, we are at times potentially violating our morals and values, right? So if we shift into, we chameleon and shapeshift into a guy who can impress others, right? And his objective is, again, to make as many men jealous of him and make as many women wish that they could be with him. If that's truly his objective in that moment, when he shapeshifts into that guy, he's going to start acting like that guy. And part of that recipe could be flirting, could be courting and pursuing these women, and maybe eventually, potentially sleeping with one of them or some of them. Okay. And so again, the motive though was to be seen as this guy who has no limits, this guy who can get any woman that he wants, this guy who really lives up to the men we see on TV, right? The music videos we see on TV of the successful man being lusted after and wanted and having everybody kind of admire him and they could be around him, wish they could date him, wish they could sleep with him. So, again, I don't necessarily call these men assholes. What I think is, if you're going to call these guys assholes, that's fine. But where are they getting this data? Where did they get the desire to make every guy envious of them? Where did they get the desire to have all these attractive women lust after them? Where did they get this? They got it from television. They got it from movies. They got it from their peers, from upperclassmen or men they admired. I always say the higher you climb a lot of industries, when you get up into the upper categories of industries, I've been in the upper tier of 6 different industries. In every single one of them, the higher you climb, the less faithful the men become. There's something there. And again, I don't believe it's because they are assholes. I believe that we're seeing this amongst so many men in those upper tiers. There's something going on amongst successful male culture, primarily in America, right? There's this overemphasis on becoming the best you can be. And unfortunately, a lot of that has to do with how many attractive women can you sleep with? How many women want you, right? How many options do you have is kind of how the most successful men are being portrayed on television. So this third option that I want to inject into this, rather than asshole or addict, is the concept that this person is misinformed, insecure, and has lost their sense of self. And they are just desperate to matter. They're desperate to be significant. Because think about it, that's what a high achiever is, right? A high achiever is somebody who achieves hard things. Well, how does a high achiever know what to achieve? They look around and they say, what do people here consider hard to achieve, hard to accomplish? Well, predominantly it's money, and sleeping with extremely attractive, considered hard to sleep with women, right? So then the more money you get, because it's hard to get, as society has said, and then the more women you can sleep with because they're hard to sleep with, you must be this accomplished high achiever, right? And so to me, when we lose our sense of self and we start to try to matter and we start relying on the influences around us, the definitions of society, the things we see on TV, what we feel like people in the world care about and value, which is money and sex, just kind of the world we live in right now, these men are more of a byproduct of the world around them. I don't think asshole is the right word. What I would describe is sad, insecure, lost. That's how I would describe myself in these men. I think when we did a lot of things that we did, the motive was not to be bad. The motive was not to do bad things. The motive was not to hurt ourselves, and it certainly wasn't to hurt our life partner and the person that we love most. At least it wasn't for me. My motive was to matter, was to be somebody. And I was led to believe that I didn't matter. I was led to believe that I needed to be better and better and better every day. And that was what the culture kind of told me. The most impressive guy in the room is the guy who was accomplished the most. And, unfortunately, as the world has evolved, a lot of that has to do with how big's your house, how nice is your car, how hot's your wife, and how much money you got. I mean, that's just really kind of how we've defined success, which is really sad because none of those things actually really matter. In fact, pursuing those things usually results in the destruction of your life and a lot less happiness than it does more happiness. So I say all this to say, addict, the challenge that I have with this debate is guys don't want to be assholes, so they force themselves to be addicts, right? Because it's like, oh man, if I'm just my wife's going to leave me. If I'm just I can't get treatment because I'm right? So there's no addiction treatment to get. And again, I think the problem with having those be the only two options on the table is they have to be addicts and therefore they go get treated like addicts and pretend to be addicts. But what if they're not addicts? Now they're not getting treated. And I personally believe this is why we see the recovery rate so low at 34% and the relapse rate so high at over almost 70%. And the reason we see this is I believe men are not necessarily all addicts. I think some of them might have a little bit of an addict in them, maybe some more than others. But I think when we treat them like addicts and they just get addiction treatment and the focus is just on sex and porn being used to emotionally regulate, I think we're missing the mark here. I think we're missing men using women to enhance their self-worth, men fishing for compliments, validation, attention, to feel like they matter, to impress others. I think, that's not addiction. That's just called faulty brain processes that these men adopted that they need to change. So again, why does this matter? Because I think if men are just getting addiction treatment and they're not addicts, I don't think they're going to get the results that they want. I don't think their spouses are going to see the recovery that they want, right? So I think we do need to examine all of the things that have kind of entered our brain over the years and start assessing, how much of this is contributing to my compulsive behavior and my desperation to basically compromise my values so that I can get these little hits of attention, validation, superiority, accomplishment, whatever it is that you've become compulsive around. So again, I don't know if is the right word. I think insecure, I think unsure, I think lost, I think feeling behind, I think feeling inadequate and like you're not enough yet. I think there's a lot of other things that describe these men better that make them act the way that they act. Again, I think asshole is a little harsh, and I think it's going to actually harm their recovery if we only pin them in these two options, addict or asshole.